Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello. Thank you for tuning into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Shubh, and today I have quite an exciting announcement. So as some of you might know, I fled to Singapore when the US started collapsing in March. And Singapore has been pretty good so far. You know, we opened up a few weeks ago. I've been eating out at restaurants again, which I thought wouldn't be a reality for at least another 6 months. I'm very grateful for that. But one of the restrictions that eased up this week were restrictions on cinemas. And believe it or not, I went to the cinema to watch a movie yesterday. And we're going to talk about that. But before we do, I want to take this episode to talk about cinema in the year so far and some of the new movies that came out this week and last week, especially because I didn't, get a chance to talk about some of the new releases outside of the old guard last episode because of Matt. I hope you guys enjoyed his appearance because I certainly loved having him on. Again, his podcast, A Filmmaker's History, is out on Spotify, and my first episode an appearance on that is also there. So be sure to check out the Bambi episode. But we're going to start this episode by discussing the new Andy Samberg movie, Palm Springs. Then we're going to move on to the new Tom Hanks movie, Greyhound, featuring his son Chet Hanks, by the way. And following that, we're going to talk about the movie that I watched in the cinema, Mr. Jones. We'll close off today's episode by talking about 5 of my favorite films of the year so far, but I want to preface this by saying that I have not seen so many movies. But, that's what this is all about. I'm going to keep watching, and hopefully you'll keep listening to me talk about them. But for now, let's get into it. Let's start with the first movie of the week, Palm Springs. So Palm Springs is the story of Niles. He's a classic Andy Samberg character. He's like the sad boy. We can't help but love him. He begins the day at his girlfriend's best friend's wedding and seemingly sort of wades through the mundane motions of it all until he saves Sarah, the bride's black sheep sister, played by Kristen Milotti, from having to make a speech that she is too drunk to make. Their attraction leads them out of the wedding until a few events lead Sarah to joining Niles into an unlimited Groundhog Day-style purgatory. Now, this movie is directed by Max Barbakow and written by Andy Sierra, who have been a filmmaking duo since their days at AFI, and was the most expensive acquisition at Sundance last year, at, I think, $17.5 million and 69 cents in classic Lonely Island fashion. Now, this movie comes from a genre of its own, the Groundhog Day purgatory movie. 50 First Dates comes to mind, Edge of Tomorrow, Gears of War, Before I Fall, Happy Death Day, even Russian Doll on TV. This has been done so many times before. But Barbakow and Sierra, they beg to ask the question in this film, what if a moral lesson, like it is in Groundhog Day and so many of these other movies and TV shows, what if that moral lesson isn't enough to change the predicament of our hero? In this case, heroes. Now, this film takes the concept of one person in complete purgatory and doubles it. I imagine spending the rest of your life in eternity with a stranger. It's like imagining an arranged marriage, almost. It's like Harold Ramis meets Jean-Paul Sartre. It's No Exit meets Groundhog Day. It's fantastic. It's a comedy also about isolation and repetition, which obviously doesn't sound very appealing at this time, because most of us are also living lives full of isolation and repetition. But don't let that dissuade you from watching this movie. It's the movie that represents the burnt out feeling that we're all feeling. We're all tired. Every day is the same. We wake up to screens and occasional bursts of daylight. For me, barely any daylight at all because I'm staying up all night. We worry about whether or not we've taken our mask. We try to refit community activities to be done in isolation. We're not in a literal time loop right now, but it definitely feels like one. And this is where Palm Springs comes to our rescue. At this point, millennials, like the stars of this film, are approaching their 30s. The 30s are an age that we're all socialized to sort of believe into being the age of stability, when we all, settle down, find the right person, sort of look into getting married. That's what the traditional sort of 30s are like. But this stability just doesn't seem to be coming anytime soon, especially considering what's going on outside. But that's what makes it so good. What makes Palm Springs so good and stand out is that it's not that concerned with the fact that the characters are stuck in a time loop. Obviously, it's there. It's all-encompassing. It's ever-present. But it's also a fact of life, the same way we've come to accept our predicament right now with sheltering at home. It does this by introducing the main character, Niles, as having already been living in it. And we only sort of learn about it the same way I discussed the old guard and their narrative tradition of entering a new sort of realm through the eyes of a new character. We only learn about this huge gimmick because something weird happens, because Sarah, the sister of the bride, gets trapped in the purgatory as well. Melody is excellent. She gives depth and complexity to this character that could have so easily been a manic pixie dream girl. Shout out to Casey for dissecting that in his last episode, because honestly, wow, what a brilliant dissection of that. I had so many points that I didn't even think about. But this is a character that definitely could have ended up in that role. Another thing that this film does is you don't see any references to Groundhog Day. At least not verbally. There's no mention of it. And Groundhog Day as a concept is so well known that if anyone was to even get stuck in something like this, even in a movie, the writer's first choice would probably be like, oh, okay, maybe I'm in Groundhog Day. The fact that Samberg alludes to this, but doesn't actually say it, he says, it's one of those infinite time loop situations you might have heard about to Sarah in the beginning. That's one of the little things that makes this movie so subtly funny. This movie also features J.K. Simmons. Now, you can't talk about his role without spoilers, but I will say, fantastic performance with a pivotal role. And Dale Dickey also shows up as a biker chick, proving that she's an incredibly versatile, incredibly reliable character actress. And Samberg brings this new darkness to the usual goofball persona that we've come to love and adore from the Lonely Island star. Now, this is really well written because it's so driven by character. The two main characters sort of really drive this film through. I hate using the words flawed and complex when discussing characters because it just feels so pseudo-intellectual. But Sierra really makes sure that Niles and Sarah are both flawed and complex. But what really sort of makes this a character-driven piece is the fact that they're almost foils of each other. Samberg's Sarah and Samberg's Niles and Melody's Sarah, they're not only complex, but they challenge each other to change. They're both lying to themselves, they're both afraid of intense feelings, but because of their challenging each other, they escape their immaturities, their emotional immaturities, and change, evolve in a way that really makes us want to root for them, And in the process, something deeper within their own chemistry, undeniable chemistry, I might add, sort of unfolds in an organic way. But one of my favorite things about this film is the deeper hidden philosophy of it. It's again, to connect to the pandemic, like all art has to be done at this point. It's not hard to view it that way, but the subtext is pretty much text. We're all trapped. But Niles sort of sums up his take on this situation by saying, the only way to really live in this is to embrace the fact that nothing matters. To which Sarah counters, well, then what's the point of living? And then he says, well, we kind of have no choice but to live. So I think your best bet is to just learn how to suffer existence. This fate has doomed not only these characters, but all of us to some weird form of nihilism. Well, at least me, especially in the face of all the people doing home workouts and yoga and how the entire system is sort of collapsing around us. But Palm Springs was made and conceived in a pre-pandemic world, in a world where this allure of nihilism was still popular. You see it in so many more TV and film appearances. This idea of sacrifice and the way that it's been created, this purgatory, it's less of a goofy premise and more of a reflection of what things are at the moment. On some days we feel like them in that we get up, we improvise, we make the most of our day, carpe diem. But on most days, definitely on most days, at least for me, I could say, we just get lazy or mean or lazy. we can't stand talking about the situation, but there's nothing else to talk about. It's tedious, it's fascinating, it's everything in between. Whatever happens, our eyes will open to the same reality for the foreseeable future. But that's what elevates this film from a clever dark comedy to a poignant story. The belief that the moral vision of this film, that it's worth trying to hold on to some kind of decency, even when nothing in the world seems to matter. Since life can sometimes be pointless and tedious, and whether or not you're stuck in a time loop, you might as well spend it with someone you love. The jokes in this film come in fast waves, but the undertone of this film is a heavy and lingering depression. A sense that it wouldn't really matter if life returned to normal, because normal life waits its own sort of empty, repetitive nightmare. I've really made this film sound much darker than it is. At the end of the day, it's still a Lonely Island comedy. It's still the Lonely Island sort of irreverent humor that would add 69 cents to the most expensive bid in Sundance history. And the chemistry between Melody and Samberg is so infectious that it just isn't as magical when they're not together. It's one of those movies that's incredibly heady, and I love talking about heady movies, as you can see. I spent probably 5 minutes talking about the philosophy of this film, but it's so funny, and it's so beautiful, it's so inventive. Now, I don't want to talk more about the actual scenes of the film itself, because I don't want to give it away, and I want you to watch it as much as you can. But one thing I will say, this takes what seemed like an overdone genre of films and elevates it in a completely new and refreshing manner, something that none of us seem to have expected. Might be one of the best movies of the year so far. We'll find out in segment 4, don't worry. But my Michael Jordan Carrier of the Film Award for this case goes to Kristen Milotti for not only removing any semblance of Manic Pixie Dream Girl from this character of Sarah, but also for being the funniest and most like driven character, the one that you actually want to root for in this film. She brings vulnerability and wit and completely changes the tone of the film. But anyway, let's take a break there. We're going to talk about Greyhound and we're going to talk about Mr. Jones next, followed by my top 5 films of the year so far. So stay tuned.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back. We just spoke about Palm Springs. Again, what I forgot to mention, it's available now on Hulu, so please watch it, because it's fantastic. But let's talk about Greyhound. Now, Tom Hanks, as we all know, is America's dad. And this film, on first look, seems like the kind of movie your dad would want to watch. It's a naval drama about the Battle of the Atlantic in World War II. Tom Hanks back at it again with his World War II history films. But that's what he is. Tom Hanks is not only America's dad, he's not only the nicest person in Hollywood, he also knows more about American history than most history teachers. And that's reflected in the authenticity of this film. So Tom Hanks, he continues his role as our World War II historian with this movie. He plays Captain Krause, naval officer who's given command of his first convoy, which is a convoy of like 37 Allied ships across the Atlantic in 1942. These convoys were incredibly important to the Allied war effort because they brought not only U.S. soldiers after the bombings of Pearl Harbor to the European front, but also brought numerous supplies and aid and resources that the European allies desperately needed because they were getting overrun completely at this point. Many of you might not know, but Britain's entire war effort was funded by exploiting India, but even that didn't seem to be enough for the world's greatest empire. But anyway, I digress. World War II historians understand this section of history as the Battle of the Atlantic, which was this sort of Tom and Jerry style game almost between Allied ships and German U-boats, which are German sort of submarine destroyer boats that cost about 72,000 lives, if I'm not mistaken. Now, Hollywood's made so many great movies about the wars of Europe, especially World War II, many of which Tom Hanks has been a part of. Saving Private Ryan comes to mind. But not much has been seen about what happens in the Atlantic Ocean, largely because we didn't have the sort of technical Avengers-level capabilities until very recently. Maybe this is what drew Tom Hanks to adapt the novel The Good Shepherd by C.S. Forester. Sort of notion that he could finally do this genuinely and, do justice to it. this would be a good time to mention that Tom Hanks is the screenwriter of this project. The first movie that he's written but not directed. He directed and wrote 2 movies before this. I believe Larry Crown was one of them, and That Thing You Do. That Thing You Do got very good reviews, but Larry Crown, not so much. Anyway, Tom Hanks in this film is a true dad's hero. Now, at some point in his beloved career, Tom Hanks sort of transitioned from America's sweetheart into a more sort of savior hero figure. You know, he led a troop of somers on what seemed like a suicide mission in Saving Private Ryan. He remained headstrong as Somali pirates hijacked his container ship in Captain Phillips. He landed U.S. Airways Flight 1549 without losing a single one of the passengers in Sully. And it's this image that's just become sort of synonymous with his own. You know, Hanks this year became one of the first celebrities diagnosed with COVID-19, a thing that sort of helped us understand the depth and sort of urgency of the issue. I remember when the news broke that Tom Hanks had contracted the disease, that's when everyone, even me, we started all just taking it so seriously. From that moment on, I remember I went to like the supermarket that week and I overheard someone talking about it. They were like, if Tom Hanks can get it, I can get it. And that's exactly what happened. Now, Tom Hanks, as I said, also wrote the screenplay, but he loves this kind of military adventure. You know, he's been in Saving Private Ryan. I think he's produced Band of Brothers in the Pacific. And so much has been joked about Tom Hanks being America's dad, you know, especially after Mr. Rogers. But Greyhound is a film that's tailor-made for dads. And the dads of a certain generation. You know, people who don't want anything overly complicated or nuanced in their sort of heroism. It's like this classic tale of someone who would never call themselves a hero, but definitely does stuff like that. You know, Tom Hanks is bread and butter. That's what it is. He's played Captain Phillips. He's played Sully. His role in Saving Private Ryan. It all sort of, that's exactly who we've come to know him as. For years now, Tom Hanks has been reminding us that not all heroes wear capes. And even with sort of the frustrating minimalism of Greyhound, it's a reminder in a time where we could use that type of hero, the hero that seems to know what they're doing. That's exactly what this film does. Now, this film is one of the shorter films. It's standing about 80 minutes if you skip like the end credits. And the fact that this movie is sort of cut down to its basics, it shows you that it's one of the most purposeful and intentional films of the year. But at the same time, it focuses more on naval terminology and orders being repeated to each other than genuine moments of character. And in that way, it feels more like a History Channel reenactment of the war than it does an entertaining blockbuster. Which sort of, I guess, makes sense. Had it been one of those big potential blockbusters of the year, they would have saved this film like they are doing with Tenet, for example, for a theatrical release when theaters sort of open up worldwide. But this came out on Apple TV Plus, if anyone has that. I personally do not, so I rented this film. Anyway, Tom Hanks is an actor. You know, he finds a way, as he always does, to inject the feelings of doubt, the feelings of fear. And he can do so with just a glimpse or a squint. those trademark squints of his. But this movie offers very little outside of the events that call it into being. On one hand, this is very admirable. Admirable. It's a naval joke for you. But it's very admirable in an era of blockbusters that focus so much on theatrics and stuff like that. But it feels very of the time, especially considering the fact that we just got a cockpit drama in 7500 starring Joseph Gordon-Levitt. That film takes place almost entirely in one location, sort of. While I know it wasn't filmed during the pandemic, but it sort of displays what we can do with the limited space and restrictions that this is going to cause. And the same sort of happens with this film. Most of the film is restricted to the bridge of the Fletcher-sized class naval warship. And there's just something about this simple story of heroism, the same way Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character in 7500, who sort of navigates his way through a plane hijacking, does. But the director, Aaron Schneider, he can't seem to figure out how to bring it beyond those minimalist intentions, and in that way it just becomes a simple film that is more shallow than lean. As I said, this film's main set is the cramped interiors, and they house this crew of brave and slightly interchangeable sailors, most of whom, they live and die by their captain's word. And none of these kids are sort of afforded an arc of their own, but two standouts for me were Stephen Graham. He gets the chance to go full Brooklyn, and I couldn't even tell that he was a British actor until I sort of recognized who he was. But he brings character-defining moments for Tom Hanks, even though those moments sort of add up to be only 5 minutes of the film. As well as Carl Glusman, who makes a very, very good sonar operator. One that you definitely wanted to see more from. He just seemed like that underdog figure that you would root for in one of those bigger blockbuster movies that would eventually save the day, but wasn't afforded the chance to in this 80-minute TV episode almost. Now these broad stroke characterizations, we get it at this time, especially because, surrounding the film are these constantly, ominously death-defying circumstances that involve a pack of wolves, quote unquote, surrounding everyone on the Greyhound. But it would have been nice to see a little bit more. Now, Greyhound is beautiful to look at. Despite the fact that some of its CGI is a little dodgy. The sight of a German torpedo coming in at Krause's ship as just this sort of white streak in the water across a desolate, dark color palette of the Atlantic. It's something of haunting beauty. But most of the enemy submarines and the ocean, all of it just seems to be done by CGI technology that just looks outdated. Despite the fact that we're in a time where Smart Hulk looks like something that could actually exist. But, as I said, the colorlessness of the Atlantic seas and, the sort of urgency of the environment, despite the fact that I have to say Aaron Schneider relies too heavily on his score to build tension. But despite the fact that he does, that sort of takes away from recognizing the flaws in the CGI that could have made this film a more spectacular visual experience. But one of the moments that do stand out is when a torpedo sort of just gently kisses the hull of Krause's boat and ricochets off. That stands out as a moment of silence, but also great sort of gravitas in a sea of screams and explosions that keep the movie and its pace going. My Michael Jordan carrier of this film has to be Tom Hanks, because no one else was really given a chance to share any of the weight. He wrote it, he produced it, he starred in it. His character was the only one with real meat on it. But he really did a great job of it, so I'm not even going to blame him. Greyhound is a good movie to watch if you're going to watch it with a dad. It's a good movie to watch if you want to learn more of what it's like to be out in the dangerous seas in the black pit of the Atlantic Ocean, surrounded by constant terror and German U-boats. But it's not something that I just watch for a casual Sunday experience, which I did actually end up doing. Anyway, let's take a break there. Up next, we're going to talk about my experience back in the cinema, and then my 5 favorite movies of 2020 so far, so that you can, watch something that I actually recommend you watch. But to all my history buffs out there, watch Greyhound.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello and welcome back. We just spoke about Greyhound and Palm Springs. Palm Springs, really funny movie. Greyhound, really not funny movie. But the next movie we're going to talk about is Mr. Jones. And before we do, I want to talk a little bit about how great it felt being back in the cinema and how it all sort of worked. So I have this ritual. Now I wake up every morning doing 2 things. The first is checking up on my internship application for Jimmy Fallon and Seth Meyers' shows. So if you do happen to be listening and work for either of those shows, please let me in. But the other thing I do is to check whether or not cinemas were open. And the day before yesterday, I believe, I finally saw the news that cinemas would be open yesterday. Yesterday being July the 14th in Singapore. Without any hesitation, I went online. I booked a ticket for the first movie that I either hadn't seen already or just really had to see. Now it was weird, because Singapore, and they've done a really good job with it, but a lot of Singapore's sort of measures to avoid another resurgence of the virus, now that, we're sort of opened up, is this contact tracing method where you have to scan a QR code everywhere you go in order for the Singapore government to sort of keep tabs on where an outbreak might have led to. It's worked in Japan, it's worked in Taiwan. It's definitely going to work here because Singapore is a very orderly, sort of obedient society. So we walk into the cinema after doing all of our sort of QR code scanning and checking. And we got scanned for our temperature. It was 8 p.m. It was the last show. When I booked the tickets, it seemed that me and my father were the only ones that were going to be in the theater. And I was so excited. You have no idea. Like, I've been waiting for this day for about 3.5 months because I'm the type of person that appreciates nothing more than to be able to watch a movie in the cinema. And there's been so many films, and I'll talk about them more in the next segment, that I wish could have been released in the cinema. I wish I could have seen Greyhound, for example, in the cinema because, with the right sound system, that movie would have felt like an incredibly immersive experience that I just didn't get by watching on my laptop. But that being said, the movie I ended up watching, similar vibe, but I feel like I would have rather watched it on my laptop. Anyway, so we get to the cinema. There's like 3 other people there. We sit down in our 2 seats in the back row because my father likes sitting in the back. And the way that they've done it is sort of, they've cordoned off 2 seats and then left open 2 seats. And they've done that for every row in order to sort of maintain the social distancing guidelines of 6 feet. But it didn't really matter that much because each of the 6 of us could have had our own row if we wanted to. It makes sense that a lot of people aren't going back to cinemas right now. Definitely makes sense, and I hope a lot of cinemas in the US will sort of obey these guidelines as well. But, I was so excited, like I couldn't do anything about it. I had to go watch a movie in the cinema because this is something I do like multiple times in a week. So the movie I watched is Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones is this Polish movie, in English though, about the eponymous 20-something Gareth Jones, who's this journalist from England. And while he's sort of high on his recent successes as the fearless journalist who found Hitler and Goebbels and sort of interviewed them in 1933 when they first came to power in Germany, he became the first person to expose the atrocities of the Holodomor, Stalin's man-made famine in the Ukraine that killed millions of Ukrainians between 1932 and 33. At this time, Europe was under the impression that Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Party of the USSR were sort of undergoing this incredible economic revolution. But Gareth Jones, his real life story and his real life reporting eventually sort of unraveled that myth. Now, it's unfortunate that this film, a fascinatingly unknown and not well told story, by the way, it's unfortunate that it's told as a sort of combination of many genres. It's film noir, it's a survival tale, it's procedural, it's slow, but despite all of that, there are some incredible dramatic highs, some incredible filmmaking, and occasional sort of flourishes in very, very important set pieces. The film opens with 27-year-old Gareth Jones, played by James Dornan, serving as a foreign advisor to the British Prime Minister. And after sort of managing his interviews with Goebbels and Hitler, sort of finesses his way into getting a trip to Russia under a journalism visa. And now Russia was being very strict with all their journalists at this time. You know, journalists couldn't leave Moscow. They couldn't sort of be exposed to the realities of the harshness of the Stalin regime. But Jones is adamant on his moral crusade to understand where the USSR is paying for all of their opulent displays of wealth, and also to uncover whispers of and rumors of an unspeakable tragedy that's happening under the nose of Europe. You know, he arrives in Russia, and Jones, portrayed by Norton in this sort of infuriatingly wide-eyed naivety and stubbornness, he gets this rude awakening when he meets Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Walter Duranty, played by Peter Sarsgaard. Now, Peter Sarsgaard, this film sort of takes a personal stance against Peter Sarsgaard's character, Walter Duranty, because his Pulitzer for defending the Soviet propaganda and lies that covered up many of the atrocities is still intact, whereas Gareth Jones, as we find out later in the film, was sort of discredited for a long time. Duranty lives this life spoiled by the Stalin regime of sort of 1920s excess. You know, he has these hedonistic drug and sex fueled parties, and is completely unwilling to help Gareth Jones. But Gareth Jones gets help from an underutilized Vanessa Kirby, her character Ada Brooks, who, you know, I wish we could have seen more of, but we didn't, unfortunately. She's this firm believer in the great experiment of Russia, but that allows her to challenge the moral sort of high ground of Gareth Jones in this. And she guides him towards the Ukrainian countryside to discover the realities of what's happening. Now, straight off the bat, Mr. Jones feels like it's not a movie from now. And it shouldn't be a movie from now. It shouldn't have taken this long to uncover this story. But this sort of film feels like a bit of a novelty. You know, it becomes evident that the filmmaker, Agnieszka Holland, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, makes sense that she's the one who's made this film because it's so beautifully crafted. And the efforts of her technical team and her design team sort of elevate the script that first-time writer Andrea Chalupa came up with. Now, the script has its flaws, definitely, but a lot of it is made up by the way this film has been created visually. A lot of that is to do with Tomasz Namiuk, the cinematographer of the film, also known for High Life, one of the most beautifully shot films that I've seen of late, and the production design team. And the early sort of stages of the film established this contrast with the opulence of London and Moscow and sort of bright lights and beautiful people and beautiful buildings, with the middle of the film that portrays the starvation, desperateness, and desolateness of Ukraine in a famine. These sort of displays work together to strike a nauseating chord when Jones finally returns home, having made all of the discoveries in Ukraine. It's the middle of the film, the second act, that Mr. Jones really sort of displays Holland's command of the material and the art. It shifts from something procedural into more of a noir horror film as Jones goes across the bleak and barren landscape of Ukraine in the winter. He's visiting these desolate and empty villages where hunger has driven people mad with the sort of use of sound and this really muted color palette that makes things as small as like an orange or the blood-soaked body of a child pop out in a way that creates a lasting sort of impression throughout the film. Mr. Jones might be slightly long. It might have been better served to swing more towards the unconventional, but one of the gimmicks that it does, sort of partake in is a constant cutting to George Orwell as he writes and reads aloud portions of his famed allegory of the Soviet Union Animal Farm. The film could have really done without that, and had it done without that, it would have sort of not only been more tight and better paced, but also we wouldn't have had to sit through the lifeless reading of the book. But it's a compliment almost that we want to spend more time with Jones, especially as the rushed climax of the film sort of takes away from a lot of the time that we spend with him. This film talks about the obligation of journalism to portray unadorned and objective facts as crucial, especially in a time like now. It goes without saying that the truth is very, very subjective in our moment. But Holland's effort doesn't let us forget the respect we owe writers behind headlines and the great sacrifice that goes behind writing some of them. It's a beautiful tribute to journalism and to one of the greatest souls that uncovered such a deeply tragic occurrence that happened under the nose of an entire continent. All right, let's take a break there. We will be back with my top 5 films of the year.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
And welcome back. So let's close off this segment with my top five movies of the year. I want to emphasize the "my" in that because there are so many films that I have yet to see. Some of the movies, and I want to list them out, that I haven't seen that definitely probably belong on this list, that I will be watching in the coming weeks and we'll be talking about in the coming weeks are Athlete A, Bad Education, the Hugh Jackman movie, directed by the same person who directed Thoroughbreds, and I enjoyed Thoroughbreds so much. This is something that I'm definitely more excited for now. Beastie Boys story, First Cow. I saw the trailer for First Cow just yesterday, and it looks like such a heartfelt story that sort of defines the ideology by which we define America. And any other studio came up with a movie that was called First Cow, I would probably be concerned, but it's A24, and as we know, A24 can do no wrong. Other movies are Liberté, Spelling the Dream. I feel a cultural obligation to support Spelling the Dream because it's about what seems like an Indian American rite of passage, the spelling bee. Tiger Tail, written and directed by Alan Yang. Alan Yang is one of the minds behind Master of None, which is probably one of my favorite TV series of all time. Saint Maud, Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always, which is being hailed as one of the greatest films on such a strong topic like abortion. The Way Back, Miss Juneteenth, and so many more films. But without further ado, let's get into my top 5 films of the year so far. Starting at number 5, we have Emma. Now, Emma is a Jane Austen adaptation of the book named Emma. Many of you would remember Emma being adapted into the movie Clueless. But this film, starring Anya Taylor Joy and directed by Autumn de Wilde, it's a completely different theme, tonally, and really sort of encapsulates the Jane Austen tone, energy, wit that I feel like hasn't really been done in a lot of the adaptations of her works. De Wilde's approach to this tale, it's frenzied, it's complicated, but it's both elegant, comedic, and beautiful. It's a story about charm. And charm, like charisma, it's one of the hardest qualities to not only capture, but to explain. And this film has genuine charm. And perhaps it's the beauty of the film and how it's shot, how it's created, because every frame is a beautiful portrait. A lot of that, I feel like, comes from de Wilde's photography background. Another thing that makes this film such a joy to watch is Anya Taylor Joy. She's one of the best new actresses today. Again, Thoroughbreds. She was in Thoroughbreds, and she doesn't try to make us like Emma, but at the same time, sort of is likable. She doesn't attempt to sugarcoat Emma's selfishness. It's very evident, but you want to root for Emma. The movie's light, it's fun, it's got great pace, it's very engaging. And all of these are just great qualities of a film, but they're also incredible achievements for someone's first run at filmmaking. It's something I'll always be in awe of, considering I'm learning about the difficulties of getting everything perfectly right to achieve your artistic vision. At number 4, I have Spike Lee's The Five Bloods. Now, you definitely have heard not only Casey but also Elizabeth's takes on this film. But I feel like it's only fair to get the third. I think that Spike Lee, he's crafted this exciting but violent film that can be enjoyed as entertainment, but what makes it great is what it says and what it shows about, the perception of blackness, whether in heroic situations or human ones. One of the most heroic performances, the most standout performances, is Delroy Lindo's. And honestly, if he doesn't win the Oscar for it, I don't see any other film or performance so far, at least, contending with it. But at the same time, there were some great moments. One that comes to mind is Delroy Lindo's monologues towards the end. But the film sort of ended up as a new form of the quote-unquote Holly weird that I think Spike Lee wanted to criticize or critique in some ways, especially with the last standoff. But the first two acts of this film are genuine pleasures to watch. Overall, it's got this ambition and energy that sort of courses through the whole film, and it comes together as this urgent and impactful movie that definitely came out at the right time. Now at number 3, we have The King of Staten Island. What can I say about The King of Staten Island that I haven't already? I'll say it again. Judd Apatow is my idol. If there's anyone that I feel like I look up to in the industry, it's Judd Apatow. From his humble beginnings and obsession with stand-up and comedy, the way he approached so many stars as a 16-year-old for his radio show with no fear, just out of true passion, all the way to his commitment to learning, but also honing the crafts of his peers and providing his own sort of way to channel their voice and their energies. He's not only one of the greatest names in 21st century comedy, I could argue that he defines 21st century American comedy. And he's done it again with this film, it's his most mature to date, one of my favorites so far. I recently watched a few of his movies again, as I usually do, because, I'm a fanboy for Judd Apatow, what can I say? But The King of Staten Island has this commitment to authenticity. Without that, it would just be another hollow film about a pothead that just doesn't want to do anything. But what draws us to Pete Davidson is not just his incredibly vulnerable performance, but the world that Apatow has sort of created around it. The authenticity comes through in using real firefighters as actors, Pete Davidson's actual grandfather, the genuine emotions and mining of Pete Davidson's life that definitely sort of took place in writing this. I can imagine how hard it must have been, especially dealing with such unspeakable traumatic experiences. Judd Apatow and Pete Davidson really want us to want Pete Davidson and Scott Carlin, his character, to win. It's one of the most funny and meaningful films that Judd Apatow has done ever. And it certainly helps that both of them were involved for me. At number 2, we have The Assistant. Now, one of the things that I really appreciate in filmmaking is the little things, the subtle sort of indications of character, story, things that we learn in the first act that build up to the third act. I'm a big fan of the Chekhov gun. It's Chekhov's rule that if you see a gun in the first act, it must be fired in the third. Obviously, this doesn't mean that every Chekhov's gun incident is to do with a gun, But that idea is something that I'm a huge fan of. One of the subtle sort of aspects of this film is that you never see the boss in this film. At the most, he's a dark blur or a voice in the phone or a really angry email. You can hear him through his office walls, you can hear his tone, but you never see his face. But still, his energy, his sort of persona, it's this ominous cloud, this threatening presence, even in his absence, that constantly looms over our main character. He's just referred to as he, but the fact that we know who he is without any indication just shows how well this film deals with power dynamics. Which is why I think the director Kitty Green and Julia Garner, who plays the main character, deliver not only a masterclass in subtlety, but also the portrayal of power dynamics in film. The Assistant is this sort of critique of workplace harassment and oppression in the workplace, and it does so in a very urgent manner. So many films that we've seen, like Bombshell, sort of over-explain themselves and spend so much time in exposition. One thing that comes to mind is Kate McKinnon's monologue in Bombshell, sort of explaining to the audience what's going on. But what this film does is it trusts the audience to know what's going on. And that's exactly what makes it so great. This film isn't a story per se, it's a series of puzzles that we watch this character sort of come across and deal with. You know, we don't know what's going on, but we get the sense, the same way the character gets a sense that something definitely wrong is happening. So it makes it such a great film. And finally, my top film of the year so far, and this might come as a surprise to some of you, it's Palm Springs. Okay, yeah, no, I understand it's not as heady as... Oh, sorry, it is very heady. But I understand that it's not particularly the film that would come to mind as my favorite film. You know, most of you probably thought that it would be The King of Staten Island. Especially considering the impassioned sort of review I've given it, not only on my first episode, but this episode as well. But Palm Springs is what I call a biscuit film, because what makes a movie truly great for me is that the feeling when the credits start rolling and I realize that I'm not a ghost living and breathing and watching these characters, but in fact sitting at home in front of my laptop wolfing down biscuits that I should have stopped eating 3 packets ago. It's the movie that, you know, you get so involved in emotionally that you want there to not only be another movie, you know, not only like another sequel, you want to know everything that happens to these to these characters till the end of their lives. It's a movie that makes you want to be in that world. That's what I love so much about it. Anyway, with that, thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. You can find us on Facebook at GSMC Movie Podcast, or you can follow us on Twitter at GSMC_movies. Thank you for listening. I've been Shubh Nanda, and again, I'm just going to keep awkwardly closing this out until I figure out a closing line. So stay classy, San Diego.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.